The cries of my daughter, who was supposed to be playing in her room, echoed through the house. I rushed into the large hall where our relatives had gathered, and for a moment, I doubted my own eyes. Surrounded by drunken relatives, my mother-in-law was on top of my sobbing daughter, holding something in her hand.
"What are you doing?"
I desperately pulled my mother-in-law away from my daughter. She was shaking her shoulders, staring at me with the eyes of a demon. My name is Linda, 33 years old. Currently, I live in Tokyo with my husband, Robert, and our 5-year-old daughter, Patricia. Originally, I was a full-time employee, but when I became pregnant with Patricia, I switched to part-time work. Patricia is an easy child to care for, and she has grown up to be a very good girl. My husband is also kind, and always considerate of me and our daughter. Every day, I'm truly living a fulfilling life, but there are a few times a year when I face a troublesome situation. It's my relationship with my husband's mother, my mother-in-law. My husband's hometown is a small village surrounded by mountains, and since my father-in-law has already passed away, my mother-in-law lives there alone. It takes more than 2 hours by car to get to the city from my in-law's house, and it's so far from Tokyo that we can't go back without using an airplane. But still, every time something happens, she starts a feast with all the relatives. It wouldn't be a problem if she were a good mother-in-law, but she loves to torment her daughter-in-law, and for some reason, I was the target. My husband is the youngest of 3 brothers, and the 2 older ones are already married. Every time, my brothers-in-law come back with their wives, bringing their children. It's true that my mother-in-law seems to be making sarcastic remarks to my sisters-in-law as well, but the level of bullying I receive is different from my sisters-in-law. As I can't retort anything back to her, unlike my sisters-in-law who don't seem to care at all about what she says, perhaps my mother-in-law enjoys tormenting me more. The reason I couldn't say anything to my mother-in-law was due to an incident that happened during a previous visit. That day, shortly after arriving at my in-law's house, I was taking a break.
"What are you doing just sitting around?"
Suddenly, I was yelled and I had all the household chores dumped on me. Of course, my husband and brothers-in-law did caution her, but nothing they said got through to my mother-in-law. Not wanting to worry my husband, I pretended to be fine. However, there was one time I was exhausted and sat down in the kitchen. When my mother-in-law saw it, not to skip doing, she hit me so hard with a broom for slacking off that she left me a bruise. She watched me wince in pain, laughing uproariously. Since then, I've been terrified of my mother-in-law and lost the courage to stand up to her. Moreover, I also had a hard time with my sisters-in-law. They were cold from the first time I met them, and aside from my mother-in-law, they also gave various instructions. Whenever I tried to talk to them, they would respond with harsh words. There wasn't much of a friendly atmosphere. Furthermore, my mother-in-law was good at manipulating the others. She seemed to have spread the word that I was a bad daughter-in-law, and that I didn't value her. The relatives, who completely believed my mother-in-law's words, were all on her side. Aside from my husband, I didn't have a single ally in my in-law's house. As a result, at some point, my daughter Patricia also started to show a distaste for returning to her grandparents' house. Perhaps, from Patricia's perspective, it looked like her grandmother was bullying her mother. Even though I felt guilty, because this was the 3rd anniversary of my father-in-law's death, not going to my in-law's house was not an option unless there was a serious reason. Well, no matter what the reason, there was never really such an option. But after this, I was to deeply regret not noticing my daughter's true feelings. On the day we were to go to my in-laws' house, my husband suddenly had to work. He explained the situation to his mother and said he would come the next day.
You should come first, Linda, since there are preparations to be made. It's unthinkable for a daughter-in-law not to prepare for a memorial service.
But she wouldn't listen to his words. I knew what my mother-in-law was up to, but once she's made up her mind, she absolutely won't change her opinion. So, reluctantly, Patricia and I had to go to my in-laws' house first. The journey there was terribly depressing. Robert said he would come as soon as he finished work, but from my perspective, going to my in-laws' house without an ally felt like going into enemy territory without a weapon. Patricia seemed somewhat downhearted, too. I tried to act cheerfully so as not to worry her. We took the first flight in the morning and arrived at my in-laws' house afternoon. While thinking about how far away it still was, I opened the front door of my in-laws' house. As if she had been waiting for me, my mother-in-law came up to me.
You're late. What have you been doing?
I was sure I had told her our arrival time in advance, but my mother-in-law pretended she hadn't heard. I had no choice but to apologize. She snorted and handed me a piece of paper. Here, these are the ingredients for tonight's dinner. Go buy them immediately. The memo was densely filled.
All this, just by myself?
Then my mother-in-law started saying it was only natural that I should go since my sisters-in-law hadn't arrived yet.
I'll look after Patricia, so you hurry up and go.
She was trying to force me out of the house. When I called out to Patricia, who was playing happily with the cousins, she looked sad. However, dragging a 5-year-old around would be too much. Playing with them would probably distract Patricia. I told Patricia that I would be back soon. I borrowed a car from a relative and rushed off to shop. From the in-laws' house to the supermarket in the city, no matter how hard I try by car, it takes at least 30 minutes one way. Having finished all the shopping, I returned to the in-laws' house just before the evening.
Everyone has already gathered, so hurry up and start preparing dinner.
Towards my exhausted self, the mother-in-law grumbled about me being late and didn't give me a moment to rest. Even when I handed her the receipt from the shopping, she said,
"What kind of wife begs for money from her mother-in-law?"
She crumpled the receipt into a ball and tossed it at me, grumbling as she retreated into a room at the back. I didn't have the luxury to carelessly spend an amount exceeding tens of thousands, but as I stared at the receipt, I couldn't help but sigh heavily. Putting the matter of money aside, I unloaded the groceries from the car and started preparing dinner. Throughout my cooking, the mother-in-law found ways to nitpick at everything. While I wished for her assistance, I nonetheless quickly prepared enough dishes for everyone, where relatives were already drinking and getting merry, and began placing them on the table. Suddenly, I thought about Patricia and peeked into the room. She was in the corner of the room, seemingly enjoying herself playing with the kids of the relatives. Relieved at the sight, I continued to work without a break. An hour or so later, while I was preparing the drinks in the kitchen, I heard Patricia's crying voice from the room. Startled by the sound, I rushed into the gathering room, only saw my mother-in-law holding down Patricia. She was trying to write something on her face with a crayon that the kids had. It seemed like my brothers-in-law were trying to stop her, but the other relatives were just laughing and instigating my mother-in-law. At the bizarre sight, I was initially taken aback, but quickly coming back to myself, I forcefully pulled my mother-in-law away from Patricia. In doing so, my mother-in-law fell on her butt.
What are you doing?
Her angry shouts echoed throughout the room.
It's you who? What were you doing to Patricia?
Just trying to make her cute because she's as ugly as her mother. A strong smell of alcohol emanated from my mother-in-law. Even after that, without showing any remorse, she continued to badmouth me in front of all the relatives. I felt sickened by everyone there, and picking up the crying Patricia, I found myself grabbing our bags and storming out of the in-laws' house. Having left the in-laws' place and checking if Patricia was hurt, Patricia, while crying, told me what had happened. Hearing that, I was immensely shocked. Every time we returned home, it seemed that my mother-in-law had been harassing even Patricia when I wasn't aware. Thinking that if she told me, I would be bullied again by my mother-in-law, she didn't say anything and had been enduring it all this time with her small body. Patricia kept apologizing over and over again. The one who should apologize is me. Why couldn't I have noticed earlier? I'm a failure as a mother. Holding my trembling daughter, all I could do was to apologize. I immediately contacted Robert. Robert had just finished work and was about to head to the in-laws' house. When I told him we were not at the in-laws' house, he was terribly surprised, but sensing something serious. Robert booked a hotel near the airport for us. A few hours later, I met up with Robert, who was already waiting in the hotel lobby. As we entered the room, Patricia seemed relieved and fell asleep immediately. Finally able to relax, I slowly took my time to tell Robert about what my mother-in-law had done to me and what happened today. At first, Robert seemed incredulous, but when I handed him something, he shuddered.
Linda, I'm really sorry for making you suffer.
As he deeply bowed his head with tears streaming down his face, he apologized to me.
If it were just me, I could have somehow endured it. But if Patricia is also being affected, I can't stay silent.
I, too, couldn't stop my tears alongside Robert. The regret of not noticing what was happening to Patricia felt like it was crushing me. Robert understood how I was feeling.
Let's cut ties with my mother. When my precious daughter is being treated so terribly, I can't stand by silently.
Robert's sentiment brought me relief. He was choosing us over his biological mother. Cutting ties with my mother-in-law was, above all, my foremost wish. Additionally, if we kept sweeping things under the rug, it would likely have a negative impact on Patricia. However, simply cutting ties didn't seem enough to settle my feelings. Sensing this, Robert suggested,
"Let's contact your father,"
and began to make a call to my dad. Indeed, turning to my father might be the most effective solution. In this way, to sever ties with my mother-in-law, we started preparations. A few days later, our doorbell rang, followed by the sound of vigorous knocking on the door. I knew who it was. Immediately, I sent a message to Robert, who was at work, and upon opening the front door, sure enough, there stood my mother-in-law. She was already seething with rage. Without uttering a word, she stormed into the room and exclaimed,
"What is the meaning of this?"
She threw an envelope at me.
"Simply put, this represents Robert's and my feelings."
Inside the envelope were proof of the numerous harassments by my mother-in-law and documents demanding compensation for emotional distress. Truth be told, I had been secretly recording every interaction with my mother-in-law, hoping it might come in handy by concealing a voice recorder in my clothing. The reason I possessed a voice recorder was due to my father's influence. My father, being a lawyer, always advised me to secure evidence in case anything happened. This time, my father's advice paid off, and I was able to secure solid evidence of my mother-in-law's harassment. Robert also understood the situation when he heard this. Furthermore, my parents, who value their grandchild above all else, would not tolerate my mother-in-law who had harassed even their grandchild, and swiftly took action. As stated in this document, we are demanding compensation for emotional distress. The compensation amount was $20,000. Compared to the market value, it felt a bit high. But my father explained that it included Patricia's portion and assured me it wasn't excessive, which I agreed with. However, my mother-in-law protested.
Why should I have to pay compensation? You and your child are trying to frame me, but I won't let that happen.
She claimed she'd done nothing wrong, and it was the mother-in-law's duty to educate the daughter-in-law. She was incessantly hurling abuses. Finally, she told not to think we'd get away with this, and our relatives wouldn't stay silent, she warned us. You're welcome to do as you please. After all, we're cutting ties with you, so it doesn't matter anymore. Upon hearing my response, my mother-in-law froze momentarily. But soon, unable to suppress her anger, she started to throw things at me. As I was calmly thinking, how glad I was to have left Patricia with my parents, Robert entered and shouted,
Mom, stop! What are you doing?
Hearing his voice, my mother-in-law turned around and visibly shuddered. It was understandable since her son, whom she thought wasn't there, was standing right before her. Since he was relatively close to home, after Robert had seen my message, he explained the situation to his workplace and immediately rushed back. His face was flushed with anger. Seeing her son's state, my mother-in-law tried to deny her actions and make excuses, but there was no way Robert would accept such excuses now.
I already know everything that Mother has done till now. I won't forgive anyone who hurts my family, not even my mother. After today, I'm cutting ties with you as parent and child.
It was probably the first time my mother-in-law saw her son raising his voice and being so angry. Initially, she was taken aback, but she didn't stay silent at his proclamation of severing ties.
What are you saying on your own accord? Everyone won't stay silent if you do such a thing. Your brothers are all on my side.
Apparently, my mother-in-law thought we would give in if she said that. Then she started to yell at me, accusing me of brainwashing her son and demanding I apologize. As I was looking at her in a composed manner, "We are also cutting ties with you," one of the brothers said. When my mother-in-law turned at his words, she saw Robert's brothers and sister-in-law standing there. Upon hearing the eldest brother's words, my mother-in-law was stunned. Actually, his brothers had found her behavior suspicious recently and came to our home specifically to ask about the situation. I played the voice recorder for them too. While they were fuming after listening to it, my mother-in-law arrived whether that was good timing or not.
No! Everything this time was a setup. They hate me. That's why they're trying to make me the villain.
My mother-in-law dramatically shed tears, tried desperately to explain to the brothers, and attempted to persuade the sisters-in-law to support her. But the sisters-in-law sneered, saying it was futile. At their words, my mother-in-law turned pale. The sisters-in-law were completely on my side. After I left my mother-in-law's house that day, and was wondering how to cover the distance of over 2 hours by car to the city with the airport, the eldest brother's wife, my sister-in-law came to me. At first, I thought I was going to be brought back to the in-laws' house, but she apologized for not being able to stop my mother-in-law. When I told her about my interaction with Robert, she secretly drove me to the city. On the way, my sister-in-law started to talk about. She told me about the things she had been through with my mother-in-law. Before I married into the family, the sisters-in-law also seemed to have been subjected to similar treatment, although not to the extent I had. They wanted to help me somehow, and tried to talk to me, but my mother-in-law was always vigilant, and they couldn't approach me. Apparently, they did warn my mother-in-law once, but after that, she came down even harder on me, and they couldn't say anything or consult their brothers about it. However, this time, as a mother herself, she couldn't forgive, and decided to talk to her brothers. Knowing the sister-in-law's intentions of trying desperately to protect me from my mother-in-law, I was so grateful that I couldn't stop my tears. And thanks to my sister-in-law, the brothers also took action. Everyone believed my words and cooperated with me. No one was on my mother-in-law's side anymore.
I've done nothing wrong.
Against my mother-in-law, who wouldn't admit her fault even at this point, the elder brother-in-law yelled at her, saying to stop messing around. He was the spitting image of their deceased father. Perhaps she saw him as their father. After being yelled at, my mother-in-law sobbed like a child, and finally, she prostrated before me, pleading for forgiveness. But I was not going to forgive her no matter what. When I told her it was impossible,
"If you don't forgive me, I'll be cut off from my sons. Are you planning to take my precious sons away from me?"
she flared up again. Hearing those words, the anger I had been holding back surged.
"What about hurting my precious daughter? As a mother, you understand how I feel, don't you?"
As I lashed out, Robert was desperately trying to stop me. It seemed he thought I was going to jump at my mother-in-law if he didn't. When Robert told my mother-in-law to give up, she staggered and collapsed on the spot. Even seeing my mother-in-law in that state, I felt nothing. If it were just me, I couldn't possibly forgive someone who had hurt my daughter as well. The brothers-in-law, utterly exasperated, tried to take the mother-in-law home. To the mother-in-law, who seemed to be willing to follow quietly,
"I have sent the documents prepared this time to all relatives as well. Even so, I hope you still have some allies."
I conveyed this with a smile. The mother-in-law widened her eyes and looked at me. Then she let out a weird scream and started causing a fuss again. It must have been her last resistance, but the brothers-in-law dragged her out and took her home. After this, I never met my mother-in-law again. Then, along with the brothers-in-law, we formally cut ties with the mother-in-law. Relatives who knew the true nature of the mother-in-law also seemed to keep their distance. That being said, I have no intention of forgiving relatives who laughed at the mother-in-law's actions toward my daughter. Her bullying of me became known to those around her, and she seems to have become completely isolated now. For the mother-in-law, having grown up in a small village, with no acquaintances elsewhere, it must be uncomfortable and lonely. Before we cut ties, my sister-in-law told me the reason she had been bullying me. I looked just like her first love's girlfriend, and it made her angry to remember it. It was a childish reason. Thinking that Patricia and I had been manipulated by such selfish emotions all this time, I felt more foolish than angry. And I was truly glad we had cut ties. Through the brothers-in-law, we made sure to get compensation from the mother-in-law, and we moved quietly. The brothers-in-law are also planning to move in preparation for the mother-in-law's onslaught. Since then, we have maintained a good relationship with the brothers-in-law's families. We gather a few times a year to catch up with each other. I realized that the sisters-in-law, who I thought were cold, are actually kind people, and now they are good confidants. And seeing Patricia laughing happily with her cousins is a relief. No matter what happens from now on, I vowed to myself to protect my daughter.